Yeah, so probably during the introduction, I've already confused you because you don't see the title of the presentation. It's a little bit more non-conventional. So the question I want to ask straight away to everybody is, have you heard of Marble Run? How many of you here know this toy? Your son, yeah. Maybe you play with it yourself, maybe with your kids, but how many people, maybe a show of hands that know it? Okay, so that's already a good start because I want to start my presentation today with a personal anecdote. My company, Bekaert, I'll get to it later, but it has nothing to do with toys. We're in a lot of markets, but not toys. But last year around Christmas, when I was preparing this speech, and as usual playing with my son with one of our favorite toys, Marble Run, he was trying to build them. I was thinking about all these challenges we've overcome at work with complicated, different, siloed processes related to supply chain risk, supply management. He was sat next to me. He was trying to build independently this toy. He would build a flow. It would be completely flat. The marble wouldn't roll. He'd build maybe part of a construct, wouldn't connect to the other construct, could never get to the next level. And I'm thinking, this is a lot like the challenges we're having at work today. Because the thing is with Marble Run, it's not an easy toy, it's a difficult toy. Because you can't just start building from the bottom. You need to first have a vision, you need to have a strategy, you need to have a plan. And that's what I want to talk about today during my presentation. I'm going to tie across now to the topic. It's going to come back throughout about moving from silos to synergy and how by developing a holistic approach to supplier management, we can allow ourselves to have more impactful supply chain risk processes and have a resilient supply chain. Myself, I'm Matthew Spencer. As Helmut's already introduced, I'm responsible, or previously by a few weeks, for the Procurement Center of Excellence at Bekaert for supplier management and sustainability. And now for the past 3 years, I've been on an assignment, a mission to basically bring our supplier management and sustainability to the next level. But who's Bekaert? We're actually a pretty large company. We're working in steel wire transformation and coating technologies. We're a technology leader, 24,000 employees, 69 production sites, more than 5 billion euros in combined revenue, but you've probably never heard of us. Even though, if you look at our end markets, tire reinforcement, so 1 in every 3 tires globally, trucks, commercial vehicles, also your cars, if they're premium tires, is containing Bekaert steel. Tunnel reinforcement, construction, reducing carbon with Dramex wires instead of traditional reinforcement, energy transmission, allowing deep water mooring of wind farms. So we're all over the place, but you don't see us. Because, even with our 20,000 suppliers, we're upstream. We are never the end manufacturer, the OEM. We are further upstream, tier 3, tier 2. For some of the companies in the room, we're for sure upstream in your supply chain. And that's actually a topic that I want to talk a bit about today, and that's going to be a focus of my presentation, is this position in the supply chain. You see, we all have very different contexts. If you take Bekaert, for example, you will have seen my role. We have a procurement center of excellence for supplier management and sustainability. We probably have one group of you in the room, I think it's a little bit underrepresented, of smaller companies further upstream in the supply chain who are saying, you know, you have actually a team dedicated to work on this topic. Because in my company, it's directly with me, the procurement manager, the head of procurement, category lead. We have to do supply chain risk ourselves. And then we have the other group of you in the room, the large companies, the Bosch, for example, who are massive. They have bigger teams, maybe one person focusing or a team focusing on a subsection of what my team does today. So across the supply chain, we have widely different contexts. So I'm going to come back to that throughout my presentation because this applies to all of us, no matter where we are in the supply chain. It's been covered in all the presentations so far today. We continue to experience an unprecedented increase in supply chain challenges. And the really important underlying point I want to highlight here is our stakeholders are becoming more involved than ever. If you take just, for example, the supply chain due diligence regulations, which have been discussed a lot already today, the requirement to have basically more responsibility or control over what's happening in your upstream supply chain. Our customers are getting more involved, especially when you're upstream. So for us upstream, that's difficult. Different end markets, more customers, more industries getting involved. Sometimes they want to take control of it themselves and say, we want to know who are your suppliers, who are the suppliers, we're going to manage the risk. Other times they want assurance from you that you have it under control, but either way, they're getting more involved. At the same time, I want to go through the presentation and really stress the point. From my view, and what we have implemented at Bekaert, I really believe imposing overly specific own requirements on suppliers is not the way forward to reach a resilient supply chain. We all know what the why is, the what, but let's not forget about the how. So the why is on every board's agenda in the past years: supply chain risk. What is a de-risked supply chain? It's clear. But the key point here is the process, the how do we facilitate it in our organizations. At the end of last year, I was at another conference from one of the big 4 consultancy companies, not Deloitte actually, and they were emphasizing that the majority of all companies that they work with today are stuck trying to identify the 1% of suppliers they should be focusing on risks with. If you're focusing all your effort on identifying, you're not having any impact. You're not doing anything, in fact. And that's only our internal processes. The next step is really how do we cascade that maturity upstream? Because there's only so much we can control from where we are today. And that's what I'm going to cover in my presentation. Well, before I go forward, I want to highlight what I'm going to share today is not overly new. For some of the companies in the room, it's not going to even be best practice, because we have some huge global brands. You probably have great processes. What I'm going to share is my own experience from implementing this at Bekaert, and you'll be able to take away 2 different angles. If you are one of these upstream companies, how can you take control of your supply chain risk program? And if you are downstream, how can you approach your suppliers with more empathy, with clearer expectations, which allow them to build their maturity? But back to Marble Run, because I think I started off with Marble Run, I left it, but now let's go back to the interesting part. So why am I talking about Marble Run? The reality today of most companies in your supply chain risk processes look something like this. This is not a great Marble Run. Your child wouldn't be very happy with it. It's pretty low down. You start with some momentum. It's pretty long track. You have a lot of curves to get around. And in the end, where you want to get to, and I'm breaking the rules, is the orange point there, which is having an impact. You need to get to the end. In reality, though, this isn't just one process. You have siloed processes. You have it multiplied. For whatever your different categorization is, you have different small processes. And it's tempting to implement these processes because it's a quick way to satisfy your stakeholders. They come to you and they say, we want to work on physical climate risk. You give them the data. You set up a separate process. They're quite happy with you. Also with your customers, you can be quite fast. But the problem is with that, gradually, it's not even just one per section. You end up with all different fragmented elements. I've heard numbers in a roundtable earlier, they were mentioning 750. At the conference I was at last year, they were highlighting a lot of companies having even 800 different questions that can go to their suppliers. And that's because it's fragmented. And this creates burden. Burden on your internal resources, burden on your suppliers, because they are getting all these requests. Your team is never able to actually have an impact on what matters. And that's what this ends up looking like. So you start the process, your suppliers aren't responding, you have to clarify the questions, you have to understand their open-ended feedback, you land somewhere in the middle, you lose the momentum, your team basically gets a new priority and you have to move your focus elsewhere and you don't actually do anything. What you actually want to get to, and what most companies in the supply chain need to reach, is something that looks more like this in terms of Marble Run, a total construct. We need to be deliberate and build it all together, synergizing our resources to create momentum. So for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to, after having a little bit of water, I'm going to talk about 3 key points. The first one is about understanding the data. So basically what's already been discussed about the internal data on your supply chain. Second is about then adding on top of that a layer of external data. And then lastly, it's about uniting your resources. So jumping straight in. What do I mean when I say understanding your supply chain? It's about building a common understanding of what matters in your supply chain. So bringing together, like it's already been discussed, all those requirements from your industries, from your customers, from your internal policies, bring it all together into what matters. This is not something new, but somehow for the past 20, 30 years, it's still not been solved for a lot of companies. And what it really means, in my company at least, is one simple sentence which has a lot behind it. So structured supplier data maintained centrally through a connection to your processes. Source to pay, so tactical, and your category strategy, strategic processes. If I break it down, structured supplier data. So you need to know what is actually important to know about your suppliers upfront. Normally, somebody in your organization already knows the information, so don't ask your suppliers. They already know, for example, is the supplier handling sensitive information? What type of sensitive information? So this shouldn't be yes, no. This shouldn't be open-ended to the supplier. You need to have buckets where you are understanding how are you going to trigger a risk action based on the different buckets. Are they an IT supplier who has connection to your system? Are they a non-IT supplier who has access to some customer IP, for example? Different buckets trigger different actions. You need to rationalize your different inputs. And there's a lot of these things to think about, but you need to structure it. It needs to be maintained centrally. So a lot of the companies, like I'm mentioning, different contexts. If you are further upstream, you're a small SME, you won't have an S2P suite to store that. You won't have a risk solution. You won't maybe even have SAP. So it doesn't matter where you put it, to be honest. And there's a lot of hate on Excel, but some companies are doing Excel great. You can do Excel well, you can do Excel bad, right? So what's most important is it's maintained centrally. And the last point is about sustainability and maintenance. So connect it to your systems. If you do this as a one-time exercise, the data that you've collected on all your suppliers is useful for the 1 minute after you have actually collected it. You need to make it so that each time you're running an event, each time you're onboarding a new supplier, the data's added, and each time your category teams are reviewing the strategy, they are adding, again, reviewing and updating those parameters in your system. After you have all this different data, for me, supplier segmentation is then the next step. So this is what I would call the holistic grounder. And I think a lot of the large companies are thinking this is not at all something new. We've had this for ages. I hope a lot of companies, or most of the companies, have it. But in reality, I would challenge you to go to your suppliers, some of the smaller ones, ask 10 suppliers, who are your key suppliers? How have you segmented your suppliers? And you'll be amazed to see how little actually even understand who are an important supplier in their supply chain. So by understanding your suppliers, you can segment them in a way that's easy to explain to everybody. Starting at the top, you have the more strategic suppliers. At the bottom, you have the transactional. But there's different things you can do. I'm also responsible for SRM, so partnerships, that's something separate. But for us as risk management professionals, the real key point is differentiating, in my company, monitored and approved. So which of your suppliers have a significant commercial or any other important impact, and which ones just don't matter? Because in reality, these are not equally weighted boxes. For us, with our 20,000 suppliers, 15% are in that upper bucket and only 85%, so the mass, are in the bottom. So in a lot of cases, we're able to scope out 85% of suppliers with basically a simple filter at the beginning. How does that look now in your marble run? Going back to marble run. Your track gets simpler. You cut out some of the curves because you didn't have to engage those suppliers. It's shorter because it's less questionnaires that you have to take the answers from. Basically, you have a better chance of getting to the end, maybe not quite. You reduce your engagements. I have two internal examples to illustrate this point. So I mentioned I'm responsible for supplier management and sustainability. When I joined Bekaert, we have a huge sustainability ambition. We really want to be the leader in our industry in that area. And we had one KPI under my responsibility, which was all of our strategic suppliers should be leading in ESG. So for us, that means having an EcoVadis rating above our expectation. And I dug in to understand, what are we actually doing there? What are we calculating? What are we reporting? And what I found out was, the actual calculation was, what proportion of our total spend has an EcoVadis rating that high? So on a 2030 ambition, that means you would need 20,000 suppliers to have an excellent EcoVadis rating, which is, anybody who's using a system like that knows, is absolutely impossible. When you have now a segmentation, you understand who is important, you can use those definitions. So quickly we were able to say now, our strategic suppliers are the upper three segments, we move focus away from the 85%, it becomes possible with some tweaks. Another internal example relates to data security risk. So just recently, towards the end of last year, we had one of our new business units, Energy Transition, come to us with a new project. They had a really interested automotive OEM who wanted us to participate in a tender. But they said, you need to have TISAC certification. So we did a gap analysis and we identified with IT suppliers, we're good, but what about with the non-IT suppliers handling sensitive IP? And so the project team came to us and said, these are all of the suppliers in this project, and this is the questionnaire that we want to send to them, so go and send this. But we paused for a moment and we said, one moment, looking at our current data, which of the suppliers actually matter for this context, for this requirement in TISACs? We were instantly able to cut out several of the suppliers because they were transactional. And then we added an additional structured question for all future suppliers we onboard, in our system, which is about that sensitive data that I mentioned. So doing those buckets so that for this group and for future groups, we're able to bucket it in an easy way. And what it meant was instead of 100% of suppliers in that project, we only had to directly engage 10% of them. So a massive reduction. So that's your internal data. But now the next step, and what I will argue a little bit differently, is external data. So you understand internally what matters to you. You use what your teams and business actually know about your suppliers. The next step is using external data. External data and tools, it's improved exponentially over the past 3 years. We are also replacing our tool just this year because we did a market scan and saw the massive trajectory and improvements made in some of the providers. The sooner you invest, the better, because not only because the earlier you engage, the better rate you get, but also because you're losing value in the meantime. And what am I really arguing here? I'm saying use available data first, direct engagement last. So I think there's still a lot of stigma out there about data, especially things like adverse media. That like several years ago, if you were going to use this data, you'd just get massive inbox with different alerts, every article ever written about a company. It's different now. What we're actually talking about is early warnings. It's already been spoken about in some presentations. Early warnings. What are likely things that have predicted risks in similar companies? Other data that's available, certifications. You don't need to ask a supplier, it's available. Publicly disclosed information. I asked the question, how many of you already in January have answered a questionnaire from a customer with something which you already publicly disclosed? Hands, maybe, or anybody? Okay. I could be in the wrong room because I've already had more than one that we've had to answer like this because we get customer questionnaires all the time. They're not reading annual reports, they're not reading publicly disclosed information, and they're asking you the replicated questions. Yeah. So often when you engage your suppliers, before you look at the data, you're replicating effort that's not actually needed. Another thing that I would highlight about direct engagement last, when you take this approach of using external data to the fullest, you also have an obligation to contribute to that data. So what I mean by that is not using own questionnaires, but using data sharing platforms. Sustainability-wise, that's EcoVadis, that's SEDEX, that's data sharing also for your audits, like with SMETA audits, because the more we all contribute to that, the more we all benefit later. So if we're putting data in, everyone in the room is putting data in, gradually you need to ask your suppliers less because all the information is already available. And again, what does that look like in terms of your marble run? So straight away, you've been able to automatically deprioritize a lot of cases because by looking at the data first, even before you engage the suppliers, you're able to see that there are some companies that have risks right now that need focus. So you're able to put that focus on a simple track. Anybody who was really looking at the marble runs will also notice that the end point has changed in your marble run. And that's because when you take a huge amount of data, instead of chasing questionnaires in open-ended questions, instead of you use data, you're actually able to see across your 20,000, 50,000, however many suppliers you have, pockets, buckets of material risks for your supply chain where you can actually really have an impact. So the topics that you actually need to focus on suddenly get somewhat smaller and you can put much more focus. An example in my company of how we've used external data in this way relates to supplier contingency planning. So we are automotive, so we are IATF certified. A number of years ago before my time, we had an audit finding. Bekaert doesn't have systematic enough approach on supplier contingency planning. So it was put in place a procedure. We're going to ask all critical suppliers to provide a supplier contingency plan. So what are you going to do in event of all these different kinds of risks? What is the supplier's backup plan? Which is a great ambition because critical suppliers, it means it's key to your end product, key to your customer, so it has a big impact. The problem is at Bekaert, we have 2,000 critical suppliers. That's 2,000 contingency plans that at an absolute minimum need to be refreshed annually. So in reality, what you end up with is a series of partially completed contingency plans. And whilst you're focusing on collecting it from the 2,000, you probably have one that if you looked carefully at the data first, has a higher risk that you haven't got the contingency plan because you're trying to get them all. So by using data, we were able to say, actually, we first put this lens on top of our critical suppliers and say, it's a critical supplier, but which suppliers have those warning signs? Which suppliers actually are likely to have some kind of issue disruption? And those are the ones that we take the mitigation actions on, like with contingency planning in this case. So you've used now the internal data, you've used your external data, but unfortunately it still looks something like this because it's still multiplied. So you're a bit more efficient, you have some momentum, but it's sub-optimized because you still have every team working in more efficient silos, effectively, is the situation. And I say sub-optimized because the reality when you're working with your different stakeholders like this, I take the example of physical climate risk and you're working with your insurance department. They come back with the full list of risks for your suppliers and they say, okay, maybe let's take some actions on the top 10%. We want you to take actions on the top 10%. But how does that top 10% compare to the other risks you have in financial, geopolitical, cyber? In reality, especially actually, at least from a procurement perspective, it's the same resources engaging the suppliers. It's the same suppliers who are being engaged on these topics. So in reality, you're still sub-optimized. So that's where the last step comes in, where it actually looks like you're going again to more complexity. But the point is you need to bring your pieces together to build something that's more like a Marvel Run masterpiece, because then it's giving you the impact to make a real difference. So it might look more complex, and there's been a lot of speak recently. We get this a lot from management. We want simple processes. Can you make it simpler? In reality, what people want when they ask for simple is a simple front end. They want a simple experience. But our job as experts, SMEs, is actually to make something complex in the back end, which gives them something simple in the front end. And you see with this big construct, there's different flows, etc., but it's one experience. It's one interaction with the process. Your stakeholder knows where to go. The process starts in the same place. They understand the process because it's the same, right? But with different flows within. So for your stakeholders, it's simple. In the background, you manage that complexity. You also have your combined prioritization. So what I mentioned before, everything's coming through one funnel. You put your resources where it matters the most instead of sub-optimizing. You have shared infrastructure. How many less base plates are we using here compared with the other marble runs? A lot less. So I'm not advocating here that you should opt for some kind of suite that takes over everything. I'm an advocate for best of breed, especially in terms of supplier data. You won't find one provider that can give you everything, but there's definitely a backbone, whether it's internal built or an external system, that can tie your data and your process together, and you will have savings from that, also with the resources and people that are involved in the process. And by doing that, by reducing the cost of your infrastructure and pooling together your budget, that's how you actually make the money, allow the budget to be able to invest in these more fancy, let's say AI-driven tools like the one that my company is now implementing to replace the previous one. It wouldn't have been possible if we didn't pool together the budgets, which were allotted for different areas of risk. So you allow yourself to have more advanced tools. And the last one, perhaps, I would say the most important one for the point I'm trying to make is about proactive improvement. So perhaps you don't actually need this green funnel at that point in time. Perhaps you're actually already testing something for a regulation which is coming much later. But because you pull together and now you have a team which has, is working a bit more efficiently, and you have a backbone where you can add things on, you're able to experiment and experiment early. Why is it so important to experiment? Because especially when you're further upstream and your customers are coming to you and they're saying, we want you to do X. So we want you to implement this specific requirement of ours. If you're not able to show them what you're already doing in that area, typically with a very key customer, you have to go along with it. And then you end up creating this silo relapse because you add the extra processes. If you're proactive, which is also what my company has been doing with CS3D, and you implement something yourself, you test how you want to approach it, when your customer comes to you, you can say, we also find that really important. This is how we're managing it. So that's the difference. But it also requires from the OEMs a change in mindset. I have an example on this. We had an extremely key automotive customer who came to us at the end of last year and said, we want visibility on the full supply chain, full raw material supply chain. We want you to give us all of your direct suppliers. We want all of your direct suppliers to put their data in our system and all the way up the supply chain. All sensitive data, of course. This you cannot add on to your process. It's something totally separate, very customer specific and non-maintainable. But at that time, we had nothing on tier N, and it was a really key customer. We were in the middle of a new contract negotiation, so we had to reluctantly do something on that. Now we're implementing something proactive. Next time we get a request, we will steer them towards what we do in this approach. And that a little bit brings me towards my conclusion. So I strongly believe we're only going to achieve truly resilient supply chains when we build the maturity of our upstream suppliers. You cannot manage it all from the OEM side of the picture. But there's two angles to that. First, we need actors throughout the value chain to take control of their programs, because today, honestly, it's often very reactive with our smaller suppliers. And on the other hand, we need OEMs, we need these large, huge global brands to facilitate that with more empathy and understanding that the situation in your suppliers upstream is not the same as the situation you have in your organization. They need to give clear expectations, but they need to give flexibility in execution, not do this. How are you managing this today? Because their impact is huge. They do motivate us to change, but if you're too specific, you'll create silos and your suppliers won't have impact, and then you will receive the disruptions in the end. And how do the upstream suppliers need to do this? Exactly through their approach I've mentioned and I'm advocating. So they move from a low impact siloed approach by first having a deliberate supply chain risk strategy. So understanding the supply chain, what actually matters in their specific unique context, using external data first, so limiting the engagement as much as possible. And lastly, bringing it all together, unifying your resources. And through that, throughout the supply chain, we can create a high-impact, holistic approach towards supply chain risk management. So that's what I wanted to share today. So thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives during the roundtable. If you would like to connect with me, there's a QR code straight to my LinkedIn. Thank you.